Okay, let's get started. So we got a good crowd today. Good afternoon. My name is Gaiman Yi. I'm the Technical Director of the i4energy Center. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to those that are viewing this seminar via the web. I just want to make a public service announcement first. I've been reminded that everyone here should dispose of their compostable parts of their lunch in the correct bins. I think almost everything that you are consuming for lunch is compostable, except for the aluminum foil, the plastic wrap, and the water bottles. Let me introduce today's speaker. His name is Terry Mohn. He is the founder and chief strategy officer of General Microgrids. The company was previously known as Balance Energy and is located in San Diego. The company engineers and builds clean and renewable electric generation that reliably meets the demands of utilities, municipalities, military bases, and communities. Terry was previously Vice President Innovation at BAE Systems, and before that he was the Chief Technology Strategist for Sempra Energy, which owns both San Diego Gas and Electric and SoCal Gas. Terry has 30 years experience in the business integration of technologies, primarily supporting smart grid, home automation systems, communication systems, distribution automation, smart metering, and demand response. He is also very involved in technology research, funding, and commercialization, and works closely with major California universities, including Berkeley. Terry presently serves as Vice Chairman of the Gridwise Alliance. Prior to his energy roles, Terry was Chief Technology Officer for an international broadband media company and also founder of 2 internet companies. Let's welcome Terry.
Thanks, Damon. Appreciate it. Just want to do a mic check. Everybody here okay? Here in the back? Very good. Well, thanks for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here. This is my second presentation. The first time I was here was a couple years ago in the other building. So this is really a beautiful place. The title of my talk, you can see, and you saw it in the promotion for this, what's so great about a smart grid? I'm going to talk about that. But really, the real story is, how do you look at the implementation of smart grid technology when we are very concerned about our climate? And so this is the real question, is how do you balance what's happening with climate change and climate legislation, potentially climate legislation, greenhouse gas emissions? How do you do that effectively, anticipating the rise of renewables, but then implementing it over using a smart grid? So as Gaiman mentioned, this is my company, General Microgrids. I founded this company just a couple of months ago. We're just getting off the ground right now. We do one thing, we build microgrids. I'll be talking about that a little bit later, explain what microgrids are. But also I've been involved in the smart grid arena since its inception. I was one of the founding members of the Gridwise Alliance, which is a consortium of about 150 companies now, mostly Fortune 50 companies. We also have a lot of universities who are focused on driving the adoption of smart grid across all stakeholder groups. That would be from academia to federal legislation, state legislation, and even in the way in which we implement smart grid technologies. Some of you are familiar with an organization within the Department of Commerce called the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'm an advisor to that group. I was just appointed to a 3-year advisory role there to ensure that the adoption of standards are uniform across all stakeholder groups. And we have many, many activities going on. If any of you are interested about what we're doing there in NIST, be happy to talk about it later. But anyway, I've been very involved in the adoption of smart grid since its inception. As Gaiman said, I was with Sempra Energy for a number of years. I started the smart grid practice in San Diego Gas and Electric and worked very closely with the 3 California investor-owned utilities to ensure that the solutions that were procured by those utilities were relatively uniform in the way in which we looked at the adoption of them. But today I'm going to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, renewable energy, and the the introduction of smart grid to achieve some of the policy goals that we expect to see coming up. So I'm going to look in three major areas. The fact that we have an uncertain legislative agenda right now for climate change. But in spite of that, we see that energy consumption is rising. And how do we start to deal with the changing mix of generation capacity? We also notice that the cost of electricity is going up. Some of that is because just we're building more assets to accommodate the demand, but other reasons for why costs are going up I'll reveal a little bit later. And then finally, the adoption of technology and how we can start to integrate that. By the way, I don't know what the forum is. If you guys like to ask questions midstream, what I'd like to do is hold off questions until the end. But if there is a point that I made that is unclear, please go ahead and ask a clarifying question. But specific questions about detail or tangential information, let's wait until the end, if you don't mind. But I'm happy to take clarifying questions anytime. 2009, 2010, we noticed that there was a huge drive to focus on renewable energy. The Energy Information Agency has estimated that approximately 10%, a little over 10% of our generation capacity is renewable, looking across all the states, which is good. I mean, what we're doing is we're implementing new generation capacity, but is that enough? The ERA funds wanted to expand some financing options around renewable generation, and so we saw some stimulus funds that went directly for investments in renewables, some of it for transmission lines, some of it for wind generation in Texas. So we saw some investments being made during the stimulus funding in 2009. And then during his administration, President Obama mentioned that he'd like to see us move from kind of the low, at the time it was 7.5% to 15% renewable across the entire United States. This was back in 2009. He's made some comments that we need to come up with a price on carbon. If we had a price on carbon, then we could start looking at the cost of reducing our emissions in a way that's efficient for all stakeholders. He was still saying that even though legislation didn't come out in 2010, that he's willing to consider any sort of proposals that come out in 2011. However, this was when he controlled pretty much the Senate and the House. And we've seen a lot of statements made by the Republicans that they're going to repeal a couple, or they're going to try to repeal a couple legislative actions that took place during 2009, 2010. And we know that a Republican House and even the influence they have in the Senate may push back the aggressive agenda that we had for driving renewables across a federal landscape. However, during the time that we did consider it, there were a number of proposals being made by various caucuses within state and by some of the state representatives and Senate. And this is just a real quick slide that shows kind of the differentiation between what the House and the Senate were thinking at the time about greenhouse gas reductions and renewable integration. But as we see that the likelihood for federal legislation becomes more bleak, there is a high likelihood that a lot of the legislation for policies around renewables is going to occur at the state level. A lot of you know, just show of hands, how many people know what the renewable requirements are here in here in California? What is our objective? We've got about 25% of you. So right now the state mandate is by 2020 we have 33% renewable. By the end of this year, 20% renewable. It looks like the utilities may not be able to achieve their goal for this year, and in which case, they're going to have a hard time meeting the congressional requirements. But 33% is pretty ambitious for 2020, and that goal is not the highest goal across all the states. There are other states that have higher goals than that. So we're going to see more and more of the states themselves adopt different standards for renewables. So as they start to adopt these goals for renewables, you start to look at how do the utilities that provide the generation for those renewables, how do they integrate to the grid? And many of them integrate through a transmission system. And the transmission system is a bidirectional power flow management system. And it crosses state boundaries. And so the question is, even though one state may have a 33% renewable portfolio, you might have another state that has a 5% requirement. But what happens is that utilities are allowed to purchase the production of renewables across state boundaries to achieve their local state goals. And so we start to have regional challenges that occur where power is coming from one sort of intermittent source from one state, but is supposed to be delivered to another state over the transmission system. This is a really hard graph to read, but this is, in effect, combining all the different states that have renewable portfolios spread out over a number of years, what their target goals are for their percentage renewable generation mix. And you can see that out to 2025, that close to 400 gigawatt hours are going to be produced based on the requirements that the states have for just renewable generation. Now, I mentioned the fact that we're going to be introducing a lot of renewable generation, but also the fact that we're introducing new generation means that the construction of the sites to build that generation and that generation itself is going to add cost to the current rate base for what consumers pay for electricity. Couple that with the fact that even in spite of new generation, we have seen, except for 2009, we saw for 5 years in succession double-digit inflation of electricity costs. Just in San Diego alone, San Diego Gas Electric asked for a 7% rate increase just this year because their insurance premiums went up to cover the wildfires that burned out some of the transmission lines. So there are pressures to cause the electricity prices to rise in spite of the fact that we're building new generation. This is a kind of a state-by-state assessment of appreciation of energy costs in these locations. So we start looking at all the alternatives for generation, and we can see that back in 2000, let's see, this was 2003, the yellow bars were the approximate estimate cost of generation at that time. Fast forward 4 years later to 2008, and those same generation sources have gone up dramatically. So even if we didn't spend more money on renewable generation, these other traditional sources of generation have inflated in cost dramatically. And a lot of times people are, well, why the heck does it go up so much? I mean, take a look at nuclear, for example. Why is the cost of nuclear so high? And when it comes to construction costs, safety issues, permitting fees, and regulatory fees that come into play that didn't exist back in 2003 that now exist, that's why all these construction costs and these generation sources have gone up in price. So, number one, we're consuming more energy. Number two, the cost of energy is going up. Now, I mentioned the fact that some states allow you to build generation even though, well, let me back up. Some utilities buy generation from other states just to meet their renewable goals because some of those renewable types don't exist in large quantity in that state. And so it's possible for you to buy solar generation from Arizona to feed into the utilities here in California. But the difficulty is not only that you can build a generation in different states, but the fact is that to import that energy across state lines, you need transmission grid to do that. And we're finding more and more that it's more difficult to site transmission systems. For any of you who watched what was going on with the Sunrise Power Link down in San Diego, this is a transmission line that was first proposed in 2001 to accommodate the growth in renewable generation from Imperial Valley into San Diego. And the transmission line was first conceived of 2001, was finally approved, and they're about to break ground 2010. So here's an example where we need generation, we need to import it into the region, but the biggest inhibitor of importing that generation is the siting of the transmission line, because nobody wants transmission in their backyard. And so there's these huge fights that take place for siting. So this is an article that was in the Chicago Tribune about the fact that transmission is very, very difficult to site. And I just gave you another example. There's an anecdote here on bullet number 3 that this one utility is estimating that it's going to cost $64 to $93 billion and require 17,000 miles of transmission lines just to accommodate renewable energy, just in this one region. So this was the report that was provided by National Renewable Energy Lab. They also said that in addition to wind, which is a very large supplier of renewable energy, there are other types of energy that are just as useful. And so they're looking at the blend of wind and solar as solutions for meeting the state demands for renewable generation. And these are just some other anecdotes of the fact that wind is not the only source. There is some state legislation, federal legislation, that's trying to push for other types of generation than just wind. But there's some interesting characteristics with both of those types. I'll get into that in just a minute. Because of the big push for adoption of generation, this is a graph of the estimated cost of solar generation. And for those of you who are thinking about putting solar on your rooftop, this is good news. Basically what it says is that if we compare the cost of electricity coming from the utility versus the cost of electricity coming from a solar generation, we'll eventually hit grid parity around 2013, 2014 because of the massive demand for that solar generation. Well, that's good news, right? Because now we can start to build renewable for our own rooftops. But what happens? When we take a look at the stability of energy generation from a source, typically if you look at from a steam turbine or a gas turbine, you have a constant flow of energy coming from that source. That's not so with renewable energy. This is the fluctuations in power production from April concentrated solar. This is very typical of solar. And you can imagine that with wind is very typical of this as well. It may not be cyclical, to the diuretic rhythm, but it is definitely cyclical, and it starts to impose significant stress on the utilities or on the grid when we start to generate that much energy from these renewable sources. And then also to consider the fact that there's a huge demand and desire to move away from fossil fuels for electric vehicles to electrification of vehicles. And I think this is great. We can kind of eliminate our dependency on fossil fuels if we move to electric vehicles. But those vehicles, when they come home at 5 o'clock, now they start to charge and they start to cause additional stress on the grid as well. So I'm talking about some of the challenges that we're having in our energy production capabilities. One of the others is that this is an example of ERCOT, which is the independent system, the regional transmission operator for Texas, where it's a transmission grid across the entire state that generators can bid capacity in and buyers can buy that capacity. So it's sort of like a huge bus where you have sources and you have sinks. Typically what you do with this big bus is you overbuild capacity so that you can always tap into that and know that you're going to be served with your load. So what you try to do is you try to overbuild capacity, or you try to overbuild generation capacity so that you will deal with the increasing interest in consumption of generation over years. This is a graph that shows a forward look for 5 years that the reserve margin, which is the availability of excess, is shrinking dramatically year by year. There's going to be a point in time when that reserve margin gets so low, you see that dotted line across there, that you start to cause other problems on the transmission system. Now if we add to that the concept of large wind and large solar arrays, you can imagine that that margin shrinks and expands periodically to a point that it becomes unstable. In 2009, I met with the chief engineer for California Independent System Operator, and he said that when California reaches 23% renewable, the transmission system starts to destabilize. Now, he's since revised that, but this was kind of a bellwether comment that we have significant stress on our system. So if we take a look at overall the entire United States, this is kind of a composition of what we kind of have in total fleet assets. Large generation, large transmission, distribution. Consumers are starting to build their own generation as well. That's the DG term at the end. Less than 1% of the total production is distributed generation, but what's going to happen? We're going to start building a lot of wind parks. They go into the transmission grid. On the distribution side, you're going to have shopping malls, commercial enterprises that build their own distributed wind and solar. A lot of homes start to build residential solar. Smaller builds, even some of you have watched maybe some of these TV shows where people are building wind generators on top of office buildings. I mean, we're going to see more and more of that built into the construction of buildings in the future. Approximately right now, 100,000 buildings as power purchasers buying directly from the grid. Now we start to add PHEVs, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and soon we have a significant stress that occurs. So I've mentioned the fact that all of this is coming, and we are recipients of this. This is going to happen to us. And if you keep in mind, what's the composition of our typical load look like in our house? We're moving away from our analog-centric appliances and devices to digital. And digital components are very susceptible to variations in electricity, either variations in voltage or variation in frequency. And so all that stress is going to start to impact us in reliability and even home outages. Add to that the penetration of renewables. It's just absolutely essential that we start to look at a new path forward. And that's why we've started looking at smart grid as a resolution to some of these major issues. So smart grid has been considered by legislation, it's been considered by our administration, and even at the state level, we're also looking at smart grid. And here within the state, there's a number of smart grid projects that are underway. The utilities are starting to adopt smart grid, but not uniformly. And the comment in blue states the fact that I just mentioned, that we're moving to a more digital society, and we have to be responsible to produce generation electricity in a way that meets the demands of the average consumer. So anticipating the high penetration of renewables that starts to occur, how do we start to apply technology in a way that starts to mitigate some of those challenges? And we've also noted that there are a number of distributed generation options that are becoming more palatable. Rooftop solar, localized generation for campuses. Some universities are building their own solar arrays for their campus, and same with wind. Same story for geothermal. So we're starting to see a lot of localized generation occurring. We start to ask ourselves, how do we start to mitigate the challenges that come from renewables? We start to look at other technologies such as things called demand response, which is the curtailment of load under certain conditions, and also the introduction of storage. We also want to start to encourage devices to participate in the way in which electricity is being produced. So if we can get an appliance that recognizes that there's a voltage sag or that the frequency starts to taper down, perhaps those appliances can react in a way that relieves some of the load or some of the stress on the grid system. And so this is the introduction of technology, the smart grid technology, to start to make those mitigations work. But we have to have significant systematic changes as well. So these changes don't occur just at the device level, but those technology changes also have to occur within the utility and within the transmission system, and possibly even in the generation systems. So in the future, today we look at transmission as clearly two-way directional electric transmission, but traditionally, distribution has always been radial, which is you've got a hub and a bunch of spokes, and power goes one direction, that is from the substation out to all the homes. In the future, as customers start to generate their own power, some of that power, some of those resources become available to the grid as a resource. And so we have to start looking at the utilities, considering the fact that distribution is no longer just a one-way transmission media. We have to look at it being effective in two directions. But all of these things that we're starting to add are going to continue to raise our prices. So what do we worry about? Do we worry about the cost of energy going up, or do we worry about our bill going up? And I think most people will look at the implementation of technology as how does it impact my life? Number one, do all my digital appliances work? And number two is, what does my bill look like? And if we can use a technology that manages the power flow across my devices and across the system that reduces my bill, perhaps it's not such a big deal that the price of energy per unit is going up. So let's go back to the concept of the fact that greenhouse gas emissions emit carbon, and what we want to do is try to mitigate them in some way. EPRI did a study that was just released end of last year that showed that the introduction of smart grid technologies, when incorporated with distributed energy resources, DER, would mitigate up to 80% of the emissions for those distributed energy resources. If we combine smart grid technology plus distributed energy resources, we can start to reduce our carbon footprint. This is a study that they have on their website, and I encourage you to go look at it if you're interested. So let's talk about distributed energy resources just a little bit. This is the concept where an individual or a small business has their own generator. They possibly have storage to manage the intermittency of that generator, if it's wind or solar. They possibly have the ability to curtail load. So if I'm not producing wind, maybe I turn off my lights, or maybe I turn off my water heater. Distributed energy resources are an opportunity to start to increase our penetration of renewable generation, as well as using technology in an isolated way without systematic change in a complete wholesale replacement. The belief is that we can improve grid reliability if we're managing the power flow locally rather than across a state or national boundary. One of the other things that we can do with these capabilities, generation and demand response, is many times there is a market that exists where you can bid those capacities in. And typically universities, shopping malls, and larger customers like that take advantage of that fact. Here in California, we have the California Independent System Operator, CAISO, that has a number of markets where certain capacities of generation can bid into that and sell and make money. So if there's a shortfall of generation in the market, and you have sufficient capacity on your campus, but you want to take advantage of the fact that the prices are going high in the transmission system, you may decide to curtail your load and sell now this new excess back into the grid. There's a revenue opportunity there. So these markets are evolving across the entire United States. There's 9 RTOs, regional transmission operators, that are looking at different market opportunities for their local constituents. The challenges are, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, this is a relatively new idea. This is the integration of smart grid technology with distributed energy resources. So there's risk in that we don't see examples of it working elsewhere. We're kind of conducting a little bit of R&D as we go, and we're building this out little by little, and we're learning as we go. Because of this relatively new adoption process, there aren't a large number of suppliers of products that meet your requirements, and so there's kind of a lack of control mechanisms that manage all of this. And because it's relatively new, there aren't that many incentives to encourage innovators to come into this market. There are incentives for rooftop solar. If you want to build rooftop solar, there's certain incentive programs the state offers. Same with wind, same with other types of renewable generation. There are incentives. But to collect a number of technologies together and treat them as a cohesive operation, those incentives don't exist. And for those entrepreneurs, the investors don't really understand the market. And so you won't see huge growth in venture funds until we start to understand how this really works. So if we take a look at the collection of those technologies I just mentioned, if we integrate them together and we put a control system in that makes them work in cooperation, where you have a renewable generation, but it's relatively small, you have storage, just enough to deal with the ramping issues with wind and solar, have a little bit of demand response, and you bring in a control system for all of this, and then you participate in the market, we call that a microgrid. So this is not like the big grid, this is not the utility grid, but this is acting exactly as a utility does, but it's in a very small, confined area. And a microgrid really needs to have the ability to separate that particular facility away from the grid if it needs to. So there's certain characteristics that create a microgrid. One is that you can island, but you don't have to island. Islanding is the ability to produce all of your needs by your own resources and manage that and balance that. And there's different techniques in which you can implement microgrids. One concept is providing autonomy for all the devices that work cohesively through a very robust agent-based autonomous system. There's a company called Infotility that has been building grid agents for about 5 years. And they've actually got a very good project right now in Marin County where they have over 100 facilities that are connected via these agents that are very smart, that are communicating, and they're providing access to information about all those resources, and those resources can be controlled by a master control system. And there's a couple other attributes there. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but the fact is that what we're doing is we're starting to show that there's a new paradigm in the way in which power can be produced and managed away from the typical utility. But the utility may be involved if they choose to be. This has become so interesting that Congress actually defined the term microgrid with the intent sometime in the future to actually make incentives. They haven't done it yet, but someday in the future make incentives to see that population of technology grow. So bottom line is a microgrid is essentially a distributed collection of resources that are treated as an integrated and autonomous system. They're typically centered around specific facilities. As I mentioned, they could be business parks. They could be even sporting arenas. If you had sufficient generation for all the lighting, obviously you don't have lights on all the time with a sporting arena, but there's sufficient capacity to put rooftop solar for parking and other types of generation. I mean, those are really good examples of where you might build a microgrid. Another interesting thing about microgrids is that if it's designed well, it could be that the owner of the facilities overbuilds the capacity of generation and storage with the intent of participating in the market. As I mentioned, the transmission grid is very chaotic, and there's points in time when the cost of energy is really high in the transmission grid, and you can bid your capacity into that. If you have a very cohesive system and you overbuild your capacity, perhaps you're making money all the time through this mechanism that exists in the market. There are other types of capabilities that you can do with microgrids. I mentioned the fact that voltage can sag and frequency can start to reduce. With microgrid technology and inverter technology, you can start to manage that on behalf of the larger grid. Not only you're managing it for yourself, but if a local utility or the transmission system says, I'm willing to pay for that capability, then you can build that into your design and make that as a product offering for other participants beyond just yourself. So we start to look at the evolution of this concept of microgrids taking off. For lack of a better word, we call them cells, microgrid cells, but basically they are individual entities that are autonomous, they're self-sustainable, they can connect to the grid, they don't have to connect to the grid. But they have many different customer profiles. I mentioned already universities, business parks, small electric co-ops, definitely municipalities. These are publicly owned nonprofits who have all the assets themselves to manage the needs of the city, but the city grows in different ways. They may have a suburban area and they may have a commercial area, and one area may have the ability to generate more power than they actually need, and so they need to be able to spread that around through the community. And through the technology of microgrid, you can do that efficiently, plus introduce the concept of renewable generation. And the ownership models for these can be varied. Microgrids can be owned by the individual customer, they can be owned by third parties, they could be owned by the utility. We've even talked with real estate investment trusts who would be willing to make investments just in microgrid development across the United States. So the belief is that we're going to see them emerge, and we've already seen them start to emerge without being called microgrids, but they are starting to appear. I mentioned the fact that they can be very involved in market-related and larger grid activities. For example, if a utility were to buy 100 megawatts of wind, and because we know that it's variable, is there an opportunity that that large capacity of wind, when it curtails and it's no longer producing, is it possible that a microgrid can actually reduce its load instantly at the moment that the wind starts to taper off? And if the wind has a gust and it spikes production, is it possible that that facility takes all that excess that the wind generator has that's in abundance at that moment? For those of you who may not know, sometimes the people who build the wind capacity, they have a minimum threshold of generation that they have to provide, but they also have a maximum threshold that their contract stipulates that they can produce without destabilizing the grid. If they overproduce that generation over that maximum threshold, they're actually buying customers to take the wind off, or take that generation off the grid. So in effect, the cost of energy goes negative. You as a recipient, you are getting paid to take that energy off the grid. So these are great opportunities where autonomous, intelligent systems that work on the distribution system interact with what's going on at the transmission site. So if we believe that these are going to emerge, will they start to collect in pockets? And if they do collect in pockets, can they start to interact with one another? Can we start to say multiple microgrids now can exchange power? Let's say that you have two microgrids adjacent to each other. They both have solar. One of them has a cloud passing over. The other one doesn't. Why not flow the power from one to the other to accommodate the shortfall, and then vice versa? Why can't we do that? So eventually we're going to see a future where these microgrids not only appear in pockets, but they're going to transact between one another. They will also have the ability to arbitrate the cost of that asset. So in the way we have a stock market today, it's exactly the same, where you have characteristics that one community wants and another one has to offer, and they start to transact those capabilities one amongst themselves. So we're going to start to see a thriving market one day when the policies allow it, where microgrids start to generate and exchange power. Taking this even one step further, if there is a future where you have multiple microgrids that are adjacent and they transact and they participate in a market, is it possible then that you can start to see the emergence of larger and larger populations of microgrids that start to behave as their entire own orchestration of power flow, and, heaven forbid, the displacement of the traditional utility? Is that possible? Well, I predict that one day we will see that. I think even though that we have a lot of capital assets in existing utilities transmission systems today, I think that because pockets of these generation sources are coming up, microgrids are starting to develop, that one day in the future we're going to see a future where microgrids become the normal and traditional franchise utilities start to disappear from our society. So a couple things that we have to think about when we implement a microgrid, or when we consider the implementation of a microgrid, is you've got two major aspects that you're managing. One is power management, voltage, frequency, phase angle, and the transients of those, and also you're managing digital information that occurs with them. How do you orchestrate and automate distributed energy resources? How do you monitor them? How do you ensure that if there is a transaction that you've accounted for the transaction, that it's settled, and the payments are taken care of? And then how do you start to use other types of technology like forecasting, either forecasting for wind, forecasting for weather, forecasting for cloud cover, even humidity. Humidity is the same as a cloud as far as the solar panel is concerned. So you have to start taking in future casting into very interesting new models, sort of the way in which derivatives work in the stock market today, which are kind of an insurance against certain things happening. You start to look at other capabilities using very sophisticated software tools to manage this future of microgrids. I briefly covered the subject of ancillary services, but what I said was there are lots of markets that the regional transmission operators are offering. One of them is distributed generation or generation. The other one is demand response. One is frequency regulation, which is to ensure that the frequency of the grid is 60 hertz. There's a thing called volt-var, which is ensuring that you're matching impedance between all the participants in the grid. All of those are options that a regional transmission operator may offer as a product that individuals can sell into. So those are new opportunities for microgrids as well. And I earlier talked about the concept of microgrids that emerge will start to cohabit and work with each other. So we see that there's a future where microgrids are networked together. As we start to see that occur, you may start to look at resources that are useful for multiple different communities, but the resource is shared by multiple communities. One of them that's very likely to occur is neighborhood storage. So instead of storage specifically for your own solar array, you have storage that's available for 3 campuses that each have their own microgrid, and they all share in that one single resource. The bottom bullets are talking about just the general emergence and where we're going to see them occurring, where microgrids are going to occur. We're going to see them within municipal districts first. We're going to see them in individual building owner operators, campus operators. But where the traditional utility exists, like the investor-owned utility, they have a franchise on how power is managed within their franchise, and so we're not going to see the emergence of microgrids within those franchises, but they'll occur at the edge of the franchise. So what we need to do to ensure that the evolution of this future, as I've predicted, comes true, is we need to instill some new policies and regulations, both at the state and the federal level, to start allowing competition of that generation source against the traditional utility. A study was done in 2009 by an organization called Pike Research. They did a market study of the emergence of microgrids, and this is a forecast for 2015. They said that approximately 3,000 megawatts of generation was going to be produced by microgrids from today is under 1,000 megawatts, which is a 3-fold increase. It sounds like a pretty cool business opportunity to see a growth that high. And so what we want to do is talk to the venture community to explain, hey, this is a rising trend. Let's incent some innovation in this space and get people to build products that start to address this market. So my company, obviously, General Microgrids, we do that. For the last year, we've been building the control system that manages a cooperation of not only the autonomy for one microgrid, but multiple microgrids to coexist and start to share and behave cooperatively. It orchestrates distributed energy resources. It's a very sophisticated software tool, but it does a lot of things. It manages power, it manages transactions, it participates in the market. Everything that I said must be built is something that we've been working on, like I said, for the last year. Even though I just started my company, This concept we started developing over a year ago. So, just to bring everything together, there are a lot of pressures on our society, particularly around the production of power and the emissions that come from that, the greenhouse gas emissions, is causing us to look at a new way of generating power. Distributed resources seem to be that approach. It seemed to be a means to an end that I've talked about that is very significant in our society. As those distributed resources become intelligent and we bring a control system to operate them, the microgrid then is that mechanism that allows these systems to work individually or cooperatively. It's my belief that not only can you take a single microgrid to cooperate with a couple, but you can aggregate them kind of hierarchically and treat them as units at a different hierarchy, at different levels of the hierarchy. I think it's a new growth market. There's great opportunity for people willing to take a step out right now, do something that is pretty innovative. But a single company can't do this alone. We need competition. And I can guarantee you I'm working with a lot of individuals who have a like mind that I do, who think that they also can build microgrids, and I welcome it. If we look at just universities alone as a potential customer, there's close to 8,000 of them across the United States, community colleges, state colleges, and universities. That's a huge market if those universities wanted to build microgrids. So we need competition, and we're getting close to it. So that's the end of my talk, and I wanted to take any questions you might have.
Okay, we have questions, okay?
Hi, very interesting talk. So I have a question about your business model. At the early adoption stages of microgrid technologies, do you foresee these microgrid operators participating explicitly as scheduling coordinators in existing electricity markets, or would they use utilities or other load-serving entities as intermediaries by entering into long-term bilateral contracts in order to...
So there's economic levers for reasons why you'd want to do that. And there are also some technical barriers that prevent you from doing that. One barrier is that if your facility is strictly connected to a distribution utility, that utility may thwart your efforts and may not want you to participate in a market. However, if the demand of energy on that campus is sufficient that warrants a transmission substation adjacent to you, you can say, blow off utility, I don't need you, because you can participate in that market because you have a transmission system adjacent to you. So you can participate in those markets as long as you have a transmission substation nearby. And typically they occur when your demand is between 20 and 30 megawatts and above. So, you know, some of the larger universities. So definitely the economic value is there, but that's not the real reason why microgrids are built. I think that is a way in which that the microgrid can offset some of their costs, but it's not going to be a cost equilibrate. It's just not going to be a pay for everything type of solution. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Thanks.
On the cost of producing electricity, I have some problems with the solar and the wind projection. They never incorporate the cost of storage. I think that's the only fair way to put storage in there with your cost. Even if you get to parity, I don't think you're at parity. Yeah. And the other question is, now that you've got all these individuals producing power that want to sell back, I have never seen anything about penalties on power factor and et cetera. The industrial customers have to put capacitor banks in when they do a lot of inductive loads. And is there any legislation, because when you have all these individuals getting on the line, you're going to have all the the frequencies and all these other problems. And is there any way to protect that so that we don't get like junk power, I guess, on the lines?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Those are absolutely huge mandates. Even to sell power back into the grid on the transmission side, if you don't just set aside the utility for the moment. If you have an industrial customer who generates sufficient capacity, they can sell it into the transmission grid. the transmission operator will not accept it unless it meets certain criteria. And those criteria are measured and monitored. You pay for the monitoring, and then you ensure to the grid that it's working. In the case of the utility, absolutely, they care about that as well. And one of the biggest challenges for the utilities today is this concept of net metering. So if you have a solar rooftop and you want to sell back into the grid, you can sell part of that power back into the grid, but your inverter has to meet the utility's requirements. When we start to introduce electric cars that also can have the ability for frequency regulation and storage capabilities, they too have to meet those same stringent requirements. The problem is, when you exceed a certain threshold, let's say for a matter of argument, it's 5% of total power flowing through the distribution operation. When you exceed that 5%, because the residential community all has excess capacity and they're all pushing that into the grid, now the distribution system doesn't know how to deal with it. You've got a transformer that was only designed for one-way power flow, and you've got power lines that are now very much unsafe, because if you have an outage, you still have an energized line because of all these suppliers, right? So these are all big issues that have not been addressed yet, but the utilities are just saying, don't supply us more power than we can handle up to this 5%, some magic number. And certainly the inverters that connect into the grid have to automatically deal with either a shutoff or managing these specific requirements that either the utility or the transmission system has set aside. Yes?
Hey, how do you plan on using your analogy with the grid trading becoming kind of like the stock market when electricity needs to be used right then and there? You can't store it. And so maybe you could speak to the fact that you would need automatic agents, or how would you plan on that being traded?
I believe that every supplier of energy will want to offer that supply at a cost. And every demand, every load will want to buy energy at a cost. And you will arbitrate the difference between request and offer. And through that arbitration process, you then have a market. None of those facilities exist today. If every solar panel today had an agent that said, I'm willing to send my power to this local house at a cost, and every house said, I'm willing to buy that power, they would be matched up because there's no arbitrage system. But in a future that I see, ultimately one day, those generation sources will have that offering capability through a bit of software, and then the loads will also be able to negotiate for different capabilities, different power supplies. And so that arbitration will take place eventually.
Hi, you said that in California, if you have 23% of renewable or more, you may destabilize the transmission grid. How would the storage of energy be able to mitigate that? And how much would be needed for that percent, for instance?
Well, so we design microgrids, and right now our rule of thumb is 40% of storage for the variable resource. But the thing is, the cost of storage is so prohibitive that it's just not cost efficient, cost economical, as the other gentleman said. You really need to look at storage with those intermittent resources. So you have to come up with other strategies. If you're not going to use storage, you have to do something else. One is, if it's a wind turbine, you rotate the blades so they're not rotating. You have to shed off the wind. Or you find a buyer who's willing to take that load. If I'm going to be spinning and producing generation, just find somebody to take the excess right now. But it's the intermittency, since a ramp down, ramp up, that's a real challenge. And people are looking at storage as that option to offset those ramping problems. But like I said, it's just the cost is just prohibitive to make that an economic solution right now. So we don't have an answer.
Hi, so this question was about your comment about the emergence of microgrids and the gradual phasing out of the utilities. Are there geographic areas in the United States in which there aren't really any good sources of constant renewable power? And then if that's the case, would your network of microgrids need some sort of transmission to areas in the States much farther away to get that power.
Absolutely good point. Yeah, so probably the Midwest. I think basically the easiest way to look at the particular problem that you described is the location of all the electric co-ops, the electric cooperatives throughout the United States. There are approximately 860 co-ops. All of them have the problem of buying generation to satisfy the load that either farmers or small communities demand. Where does that power come from today? Well, that power comes from either a local generator or a local generation / transmission operator. And so there's a market for that. There are people who make investments in just they call it the G&T for those electric co-ops. So absolutely, the description of the problem you described exists today in the electric co-op market through the mandate that we implement renewable generation. Even if it doesn't occur at the federal level, if it occurs at the state level, that has to be addressed by those same market participants. So somehow that will occur. The market will make it happen. Any other questions?
What exactly is the relationship between general microgrids and balance energy?
Balance Energy is the brand of the product, the software product that I showed you at the end. So this is a model diagram of a software product. That software is the Balance Energy solution. So the difference between them is General Microgrid is the company that owns the product is Balance Energy.
I think that's our last question. So thank you again, Terry, for coming
you very
second
much.
time to speak.